The rope was already around Naomi Kingsley's neck when Elijah Sutton stepped forward and said the four words that would change both their lives forever. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat baking under the August sun of 1878, and it was the kind of heat that made men do foolish things, or perhaps the kind that finally burned away the pretense that covered up what they had always been meaning to do. The crowd gathered in the square was not a gentle one. They were merchants and ranchers, drifters and lawmen, women who clutched their bonnets against the dry wind, and children who should not have been watching but were. The wooden scaffold had been built just the previous spring, a point of civic pride for Sheriff Monroe Hackett, who believed firmly that visible justice was the greatest deterrent to crime in any frontier settlement. Naomi Kingsley stood on the platform with her hands bound behind her back, her dark hair loose and wild because they had not allowed her time to pin it, and her green eyes steady in a way that unsettled most of the men who looked at her directly. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman of her time, with the kind of face that made people notice her even in a crowd and then feel vaguely guilty for noticing. She wore a cotton dress the color of old cream that was now stained with the red Kansas dust, and her chin was lifted, and she was not crying, which bothered Sheriff Hackett more than anything else about the situation. The charge against her was horse theft and the killing of Deputy Clarence Webb, though the truth of the matter was considerably more complicated than the charge suggested, and the truth, as Naomi had discovered in her 24 years of living in the American West, was rarely the thing that mattered most when a crowd wanted blood. Elijah Sutton stood at the edge of that crowd, and he was not a man who typically drew attention to himself. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had worked cattle since boyhood, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted up through the Kansas prairie, and dark brown eyes that missed very little about any situation he found himself in. He worked as a cattle drover for the McAllister Ranch 20 miles east of Caldwell, and he had ridden into town that morning for the sole purpose of purchasing a new saddle cinch and a pound of coffee, neither of which he had yet acquired. He had not intended to attend a hanging. He had not intended to stand here watching a woman he did not know face death with a steadiness that made his chest ache. He knew something about her case, because in Caldwell knowing things about other people's troubles was unavoidable if you spent more than 2 days within the town limits. He knew that Deputy Clarence Webb had been found shot 3 weeks prior, and that the horse he'd been riding, the one Naomi Kingsley had supposedly stolen, had been traced back to her. He knew that her lawyer, such as the man was, had been present for approximately 1 day before abandoning the territory on account of a prior engagement that seemed suspiciously well-timed. He knew that Sheriff Hackett had a particular dislike for women who did not behave as women were supposed to behave, and that Naomi Kingsley had reportedly argued loudly and without remorse in her own defense during the trial, which had impressed nobody on the jury, and had seemed to actively offend several of them. What Elijah Sutton knew, and what he had not told anyone because the telling of it would have required explaining how he came to know it, was that Deputy Clarence Webb had not been a good man. He had known Webb from a cattle drive 2 years prior, and he had watched the deputy drink himself sideways and make threats against a Comanche trader who had done nothing but try to sell a fair horse at a fair price. He had heard Webb boast about certain arrangements he had with certain ranchers that involved looking the other way when cattle happened to cross property lines in a useful direction. A man like that did not simply acquire enemies through bad luck. The noose was adjusted around Naomi's neck by a man whose hands were shaking, which Naomi noticed, and which seemed to bother her on his behalf more than on her own. Sheriff Hackett was beginning his speech about justice and the rule of law, a speech he had clearly given before and perhaps rehearsed, and the crowd was listening with the uncomfortable mixture of solemnity and excitement that public executions seemed to produce in people who would have described themselves as decent. Elijah did not make a decision the way a man plans out a chess move. What happened was more like the moment when you have been holding something heavy for a very long time, and your arms simply refuse to hold it any longer. And the thing is set down not because you chose to set it down, but because there was nothing else your body was capable of doing. He stepped forward. He said, "I'll marry her." The crowd went quiet in the particular way that crowds go quiet when something has happened that does not fit any category they were prepared for. Sheriff Hackett stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me, Monroe." Elijah moved through the crowd the way water moves through rock, not forcing it, just finding the path, until he was standing at the base of the scaffold, looking up at the sheriff, and at the woman standing with a rope around her neck. Territorial law. A woman sentenced to hang for a crime committed, while unmarried, can be pardoned at the request of a man willing to marry her and take legal responsibility. Judge Carmody issued that ruling out of Wichita just last spring. You have the circular in your office. I know because I was there when you received it. This was true. Elijah had been in Hackett's office 3 months prior regarding a dispute over cattle boundaries, and he had seen the circular from the territorial court sitting on the sheriff's desk. The law itself was an unusual one, born of a particular case in Wichita involving a widow who had killed her second husband in circumstances that everyone agreed were complicated, and it had caused considerable debate in legal circles and considerably less debate among ordinary citizens, most of whom had never heard of it until now. Hackett's face had gone through several colors during this recitation. He settled on a kind of mottled red that suggested he was weighing his options and not finding any of them satisfying. "That law," he said slowly, "applies to crimes of lesser. It applies to any capital offense committed by an unmarried woman where mitigating circumstances are present," Elijah said. "The mitigating circumstances are present. You've got one witness who claims to have seen her take the horse, and that witness is Calvin Pruitt, who owes $300 to the estate of the man she's accused of shooting, which seems to me like a circumstance worth mitigating." Naomi Kingsley, standing on the scaffold with a rope around her neck, was looking down at this man she had never seen before in her life with an expression that had shifted from the careful blankness she had been maintaining to something that was considerably harder to categorize. "You can't be serious," Hackett said. "I'm about as serious as a man can be," Elijah said. "Get Judge Whitmore. He's in the Silver Star right now, which we all know because we all saw him walk in there an hour ago. Get him out here, let him review the legal standing, and let's do this properly." There was a murmuring in the crowd. Not hostile murmuring, or not entirely hostile. There was some of that quality of murmuring that indicates people are genuinely uncertain what they think, which is rarer and more interesting than the kind where they have already made up their minds. Judge Whitmore was fetched from the Silver Star. He was a compact man with impressive whiskers and a judicial temperament that survived even 2 glasses of whiskey before noon, which was what he had consumed that morning. He reviewed the territorial circular, which Hackett produced with visible reluctance. He asked several legal questions. He peered at Elijah Sutton over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has seen most things and has learned to be surprised by very few of them, but who was presently being surprised. "You understand," Judge Whitmore said to Elijah, "that this is a binding legal marriage. You cannot simply, it cannot be dissolved easily. You are taking on legal responsibility for this woman and for whatever debts and obligations." "I understand what a marriage is, Judge," Elijah said. The judge turned to Naomi on the scaffold. The hangman had stepped back with the quiet relief of a man who had not particularly wanted to do his job today. "Miss Kingsley," the judge said, "you must consent to this arrangement. I cannot proceed without your consent." Naomi Kingsley looked down at Elijah Sutton. He was looking up at her with an expression that was direct and steady, and something she could not quite name, not pity. She was sure of that, because she had seen enough pity in the past 3 weeks to be able to identify it on sight, and this was not that. It was something more like the look of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not interested in being talked out of it. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was steady. She had kept it steady all morning, and she was going to keep it steady now. "No," he agreed. "You don't. Why are you doing this?" A slight pause. "Because the rope is already around your neck." It was not a romantic answer. It was not the kind of answer that appeared in the dime novels that came through town in the saddlebags of traveling merchants. But it was honest, and honesty was something Naomi Kingsley had come to value above almost everything else in the past several years of her life, particularly in the last 3 weeks of it. "All right," she said. The ceremony was brief and unusual in its staging, conducted with the noose still technically present though removed from Naomi's person, her wrists unbound for the required exchange of a ring. Elijah produced his mother's plain gold band from his vest pocket, which was a detail that would occur to Naomi later as significant. And Judge Whitmore reading the relevant words in the tone of a man who understood that the circumstances were irregular but who had decided that the law was the law and he was going to follow it. When it was over, Naomi Kingsley was Naomi Sutton in the eyes of the law, and she was still alive, and neither of those facts felt entirely real to her. Elijah offered his hand to help her down from the scaffold. She took it, and then released it the moment her feet were on the ground, and they stood there together in front of a crowd that was slowly beginning to disperse with the particular manner of people who have witnessed something they will be discussing for a considerable time. "I suppose," Naomi said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "you had better tell me your name." "Elijah Sutton," he said. "Naomi Kingsley," she said, and then paused. "I suppose it's Sutton now. Only legally," he said. "If you prefer Kingsley, that's your business." She looked at him for a moment. "You saved my life." "Yes, and you don't know me." "No, so what happens now?" Elijah Sutton looked at the square, at the dispersing crowd, at the scaffold still standing in the morning sun. He looked at the woman standing beside him who had faced a hanging without crying, and who was now asking him a practical question in the same tone she would have used to ask about the weather. "I have a place at the McAllister Ranch 20 miles east," he said. "There's a small cabin the hands use during roundup that's empty at the moment. It's not much. But it's a roof." "A roof," Naomi said, "sounds considerably better than what I had this morning." They retrieved her horse, a brown mare named Clover, from the livery stable where it had been held as evidence, the legal status of the animal now transferred along with everything else. Naomi's belongings, a saddlebag with a change of clothes, a small amount of money, a leather-bound journal, and her father's old Colt revolver, were returned from the sheriff's office by a deputy who avoided making eye contact with either of them. Sheriff Hackett stopped Elijah on the way out. He put his hand on Elijah's arm and spoke low. "You've made a mistake, Sutton." "Might be," Elijah said pleasantly. "I've made them before. Webb had friends." "I expect he did. Most men do." Hackett's hand tightened and then dropped. He stepped back. Elijah walked on. They rode east out of Caldwell in the dry August heat, the two of them side by side and mostly silent, which suited them both better than talking would have at that particular moment. The prairie spread out around them in the way it did, immense and golden and indifferent, with the sky so large and blue above it that it felt almost aggressive in its beauty. After about a mile, Naomi said, "I didn't steal the horse." "I didn't think you did," Elijah said. She looked at him. "Just like that. You don't want to hear the explanation." "I'll hear it when you're ready to tell it," he said. "I didn't marry you because I'd evaluated the evidence and found you innocent. I married you because the alternative was watching you hang, and I wasn't willing to do that." Another mile passed. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. "Deputy Webb," Naomi said, "had been following me for 3 weeks before he died. I was traveling through the territory looking for my brother, who went missing after a cattle drive. Webb decided that a woman traveling alone was either running from something or looking for trouble, and he seemed determined to provide one or the other." She paused. "He tried to take my horse twice. The second time, his own horse bolted in the commotion. He shot at me and missed, and I didn't shoot back, and I rode away. The next morning he was found dead. Someone else's bullet, but my supposed motive in Calvin Prout ready to swear he'd seen me take the horse, and that was enough for Hackett to build a case. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Prout, he said, he works for the Renner operation. He does. And Webb worked for Renner too. On the quiet, Elijah exhaled through his nose. There's something going on with the Renner land claims. Has been for a while. Webb looking the other way while Renner pushed his boundary lines north, and then you come through and somehow get caught up in it. Naomi turned to look at him fully for the first time, and he met her eyes, and for a moment something passed between them that was not yet a name but was certainly a beginning. You know more about this than a cattle drover should, she said. Maybe, he said. My father was a lawyer in Missouri. I was going to study law too before circumstances made that impractical. Old habits. What circumstances? He looked ahead at the road. My father died. The money for school went with him. There were debts. A pause. It's not a remarkable story. Most true stories aren't remarkable from the outside, she said. They feel remarkable enough from the inside. The McAllister Ranch came into view in the late afternoon. A sprawl of buildings and fences and grazing cattle that represented about 15 years of hard work by a man named George McAllister, who had come out from Tennessee after the war with $60 and a stubborn disposition, and had built something real out of both of them. George McAllister was sitting on his porch when Elijah rode in with a woman beside him, and the look on his face made his feelings about this development perfectly clear without requiring any words. The words came anyway. Sutton, McAllister said, standing from his chair. What in the name of who is this? My wife, Elijah said, in the same tone he might have used to say the weather seemed to be holding. Your wife? Yes, sir. McAllister looked at Naomi. He was a man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking at distances, and his expression was not unfriendly so much as comprehensively bewildered. When did you, this morning, Elijah said. In Caldwell. You went to Caldwell for a saddle cinch. I did. I didn't get the cinch. McAllister looked at Naomi again, and this time there was something else in his look, a recognition, perhaps, that whatever else was happening, the woman before him had a quality about her that did not invite casual dismissal. What's your name? He asked. Naomi, she said. Naomi Sutton. She said the name as though she was trying on a coat and wasn't certain yet about the fit. George McAllister. He offered his hand and she shook it, which seemed to surprise him and then seemed to please him. You hungry? My wife's got supper on. Martha McAllister was a woman who had raised 4 children on the frontier, and had therefore developed a comprehensive philosophy about the nature of unexpected situations, which was essentially that most unexpected things turned out to be manageable if you fed people first. She fed them both, asked Naomi nothing about her circumstances, showed her where the washroom was, and by the end of the evening had located a clean quilt for the cabin that Elijah had mentioned. The cabin was a single room with a wood stove, a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window that looked east toward the flat line where the prairie met the sky. It was clean and spare and smelled of wood and dust, and when Naomi walked into it for the first time carrying her saddlebag, she stopped in the middle of the room and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Elijah stood in the doorway. I can sleep with the hands, he said. There's room in the bunkhouse. You take the don't, she said. Her voice was not sharp, but it was clear. Don't treat me like glass, Mr. Sutton. I've slept in worse places than a bunkhouse. We can share the room. I'll have the bed. You can have the floor. I'm not ungrateful. I am genuinely not ungrateful. But I'd rather we establish early that I'm a person and not a problem you've solved. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, that seems fair. He rolled out his bedroll beside the stove. She took the bed, and they were quiet in the dark, both of them very much awake, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the wind, the distant call of something wild, the occasional shift of cattle, and thinking about the extraordinary strangeness of the day. Why did you really do it? She asked in the dark. A pause. I told you. You told me the rope was already around my neck. Yes. That's true of other people too. Other people didn't step forward. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then my mother was accused of something she didn't do, he said. In Missouri, I was 12. There was nothing to be done about it then. There was too much nothing to be done about it, and she spent a year in a situation that he stopped. I'm not 12 anymore, he said, and today there was something to be done. That's all. Naomi lay in the dark and thought about that for a long time. In the morning, she helped with breakfast before he was fully awake, and when he came out of sleep to the smell of coffee and cornbread, something happened to his face that he clearly didn't intend, a softening, brief and involuntary, before he collected himself and became a man who was holding his face in its usual way again. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She poured his coffee and sat across from him and said, Tell me what you know about Renner. They talked through breakfast and beyond it, trading information the way people who are beginning to trust each other trade things, carefully at first, checking to see what is received, and then with more ease as the exchange proves safe. Elijah knew that the Renner operation had been expanding for 2 years, swallowing up smaller homesteads through a combination of legal pressure and less legal methods. He knew that 3 families had sold their claims under circumstances that struck him as uncomfortably coincidental. All 3 had experienced some kind of catastrophe just before agreeing to sell: a fire, a poisoned water source, a legal dispute that appeared from nowhere and was settled only when the land changed hands. Naomi knew that her brother, Thomas Kingsley, had been driving cattle for the Renner operation when he disappeared. She had 3 letters from him, the last dated 4 months ago, in which he mentioned discovering something about the land records that he intended to report to the Territorial Land Office. After that letter, nothing. The land office in Wichita, Elijah said, and his voice had taken on the quality of a man whose thoughts were moving quickly. That's where the original claims are registered. If Renner's been falsifying, I need to find Thomas, Naomi said. That is the first and only thing. Everything else is secondary to that. He looked at her. You came through this territory looking for him. I've been looking for him since June, she said. I've ridden from Kansas City. I've asked at every ranch and trading post between here and the Oklahoma border. Nobody knows anything, or nobody will say. Her jaw tightened. He's 22 years old. He was always the one who worried about doing the right thing. He always did the right thing, even when it cost him. Elijah watched her face while she talked about her brother, and what he saw there was not grief exactly. She had not allowed herself grief yet, because grief required a certainty she did not have, but something fiercer and more protective, a love that had calcified into determination because that was the only way it could survive. I'll help you find him, he said. She looked at him. You've already done considerably more than I'll help you find him, he repeated. I have reasons of my own to be interested in what Renner is doing, and besides, a pause brief. It seems like the right thing. Naomi Kingsley, who had been managing alone for a long time, who had learned to be suspicious of offers and careful of debts, sat with this for a moment and then said, All right, thank you. The next 2 weeks established a rhythm between them that neither had anticipated. Elijah worked the ranch during the days. He could not abandon his obligations to Mac Allister entirely, and Mac Allister was proving both patient and quietly curious about the whole situation. And in the evenings, he and Naomi would sit at the small table in the cabin with the lamp between them and work through what they knew about Renner, about the missing ranch hands, about the land claims. Naomi, it became clear very quickly, was not simply smart but specifically brilliant in the way of people whose minds organize information naturally into patterns. She had her brother's letters arranged in an order that made a kind of map, and she had made notes in the margins of her journal that traced connections between dates and names and events that Elijah would not have seen on his own. She was also, he discovered, funny. It surprised him. She would say something dry and precise at a moment when he was least expecting it, usually when the situation was most serious, and the humor was never unkind, but it was always true, and it made him laugh in the genuine way that is different from polite laughter in the way that sunlight is different from a lantern. He discovered that she could ride as well as any man on the ranch, which he had suspected, and that she was a better shot than he was with a revolver, which he had not suspected, and which she revealed without any particular pride or apology, the way someone mentions a skill they have simply because it is relevant to the situation. She discovered that he cooked better than she did, which she admitted with a directness that made him feel that the admission was a form of trust. She discovered that he read. There were 3 books in his saddlebag, which was unusual for a cattle drover, and which she found unexpectedly moving, and that he had opinions about things that were not cattle and not weather, which was rarer than it should have been in the places she had traveled. She discovered that he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, and that when she looked back at him, he did not look away quickly like a man caught at something shameful, but met her eyes with that steady directness that she had noticed at the scaffold, and that she was beginning to realize was simply the way he moved through the world. She found it disconcerting. She found it more disconcerting because she was aware that she did the same thing. On a Thursday evening in early September, Martha McAllister came to the cabin with a pie and what was clearly an agenda. "Sit," she told them both, placing the pie on the table with authority. She sat down herself and looked at them with the expression of a woman who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of whether anyone has invited her to. "This is a strange arrangement," she said. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't. You married this morning to keep her alive, and now you're sharing a room like 2 people who are carefully not looking at each other, which is very polite and also very foolish." "Martha," Elijah said. "I'm speaking," Martha said pleasantly. "Now, I don't know the details of your situation and I'm not asking, but I have eyes and I've been watching both of you for 2 weeks. My observation is that you are 2 people who suit each other considerably better than either of you has yet admitted, and you are spending a great deal of energy pretending that this is a practical arrangement when it is clearly becoming something else." A silence. The lamp flickered. "She's not wrong," Naomi said to the pie. Elijah looked at her. "I'm aware of what is happening," Naomi said to him, still looking at the pie, and then she looked up and met his eyes, and something passed between them that was not small or casual or easy to put back where it had come from. "I'm simply not certain what to do with it, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Elijah said carefully, "being that we don't know each other well." "The circumstances being that you married me to save my life, and I don't want you to feel obligated to continue in any direction that isn't." She stopped. She set down her fork. "I don't want your pity," she said. "I said that already. I also don't want your guilt. If you feel some sense of duty toward me that isn't Naomi." He said her name quietly, and something about the way he said it stopped her. "I've been awake most nights for 2 weeks," he said, "not out of guilt." Martha McAllister ate a piece of pie with the satisfaction of a woman whose instincts have been confirmed. She left shortly after, and the cabin was quiet, and Elijah and Naomi sat across the small table from each other in the lamplight. And for the first time since the scaffold, the silence between them was not comfortable but charged, full of something that both of them were aware of, and neither was entirely sure how to navigate. "Tell me something about yourself," Naomi said, which was not what either of them had been expecting her to say, and it broke the tension in a way that felt like something loosening, something that had been held too tight. He told her about his father, who had read law in Missouri, and had believed with a sincere and somewhat inconvenient passion that the law was meant to protect people, and not merely to maintain order. He told her about the farm, and the winter after his father died, and the decision to go west because the East no longer felt like it had room for him. He told her about learning cattle work, which he had not expected to respect, and had come to love in the way you love things that teach you about yourself. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, where her father had worked on the riverboats until he didn't, where she and Thomas had spent a childhood that was primarily managed by Thomas, who was 4 years younger, but had always been in some essential sense the responsible one. She told him about a year of school teaching that had ended when the school board decided she was too outspoken about the education of the children of freed slaves, which she had been providing in the evenings on her own initiative, and which the board had decided was disruptive to the community. She told him this without bitterness, but with a clarity that made it plain that the injustice of it had not dissolved, but had simply been filed in a part of her mind where she kept things that she intended to eventually address. "You have a talent," he said, "for making me feel that the world is not arranged correctly." "It isn't," she said, "but that's not a reason to despair. It's a reason to work." He looked at her across the small table in the lamplight, and he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time, perhaps since his father died, perhaps since before that, a kind of restlessness that had driven him west and kept him moving from season to season without any clear sense of what he was moving toward. "Your brother," he said. "We need to go to the Renner territory." She nodded. Her eyes changed slightly, the soft thing that had been in them for the past hour becoming focused again, the woman who had stood on that scaffold resurfacing. "There's a man who might help us," Elijah said. "Jonah's white horse. He's a Cheyenne trader who works the territory between here and the Renner Range. He knows the land better than anyone who isn't Cheyenne, and he has no particular love for Renner. Renner had his trading post burned 2 years ago and blamed it on a range dispute. Jonah's never got proof, but he knows. Can you reach him?" "I can try. He comes through the territory every few weeks. Mac Allister does some honest trade with him, which is how I know him." Elijah paused. "He's a fair man. And he misses very little." The following Sunday, Jonah's white horse arrived with a cartload of goods, and the steady, unhurried manner of a man who has learned that patience is the most valuable skill available to anyone operating on the margins of a world that was not arranged in his favor. He was in his 40s, lean and watchful, with gray beginning at his temples and eyes that evaluated everything in a room within approximately 3 seconds of entering it. He listened to Elijah's account of Naomi's situation and of Thomas Kingsley's disappearance without interrupting. When Elijah was done, Jonah's was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The Renner South Range. There's an old line cabin there that Renner doesn't use anymore. He stopped using it about 5 months ago, which is unusual because it was his best winter shelter for the southern herd." Naomi leaned forward. "Why would he stop using it?" Jonah's looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to say something. He said, "Because there's something there he doesn't want his regular hands to find." In the second week of September, the three of them rode south into the Renner Range under the pretense of Mac Allister's ranch business, which Mac Allister had provided cheerfully, having been told enough of the situation to understand what was at stake, and having his own reasons for wanting to know more about Renner's operations. Since Renner's northern boundary pressed against Mac Allister's southern fence in ways that had been causing Mac Allister concern for 2 years. The country south of the Mac Allister Range was rougher, cut through with ravines and dry creek beds, the grass shorter and harder and the sky somehow even larger. They rode careful and quiet, and Naomi rode between Elijah and Jonah's, and she was watchful in the way she had been on the scaffold, calm in the surface but tremendously, electrically present underneath. Jonah's found the line cabin by a route that avoided the main Renner roads entirely, through a series of draws and dry washes that Elijah would not have known to navigate. The cabin was small and old, set into the side of a low bluff that provided shade, and it had the look of a place that had been recently but secretly occupied. Elijah dismounted and tried the door. It was latched from the inside. From inside came a sound. Naomi was off her horse before either man could speak. She was at the door and she said, "Thomas." Not a question, a certainty, a long pause, then from inside, "Naomi." The voice was thin and rough from disuse, but it was a voice, and it was alive. The latch lifted from the inside and the door opened, and Thomas Kingsley, 22 years old and considerably thinner than he had been 4 months ago, stood blinking in the sunlight with the expression of a man who has been waiting so long for something that he no longer quite believes it when it arrives. Naomi walked into the cabin and put her arms around her brother and held on, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And Elijah stood at the threshold and watched and felt something in his own chest do something complicated that he was not going to examine closely in this particular moment. Thomas Kingsley had not been imprisoned by force exactly, but by circumstances that amounted to the same thing. He had discovered the falsification in Renner's land records, documents proving that 3 of the land claims Renner held had been registered using forged signatures of original homesteaders who had either already left the territory or, in 2 cases, had died under circumstances that were being quietly allowed to be called accidents. Thomas had made the mistake of telling a fellow ranch hand what he had found, not realizing that the hand reported directly to Renner. He had been given a stark choice: stay silent and stay in the cabin, or leave the territory and find out what happened to men who caused problems for Renner's operation. He had chosen the cabin. He had hidden the documents. "Where are they?" Naomi asked. Thomas produced a flat leather packet from beneath the floorboards. Elijah took the documents and read them, and as he read, his expression became the controlled, careful expression of a man who is looking at something significant and thinking quickly. "This is enough," he said. "With a competent territorial lawyer, this is enough to challenge every one of Renner's northern claims." "We have to get to Wichita," Naomi said. "Renner will have men on the main road," Jonas said. "Then we don't take the main road," Elijah said. What followed was the kind of journey that is deeply uncomfortable while it is happening and becomes a story later. 3 days of riding through broken country, with Jonas navigating, Thomas recovering his strength with the resilience of a young man whose body wants very badly to be well, and Elijah and Naomi developing the particular intimacy of people who are managing something difficult together, which is different from, and in some ways deeper than, the intimacy of people who are at ease. They sheltered the first night in a hollow below a limestone escarpment, and Elijah and Naomi sat together on watch while Jonas slept and Thomas slept the deep sleep of the recently rescued, and the stars over Kansas were the kind of stars that existed before electric light diminished them, overwhelming and close and very old. "Are you frightened?" Elijah asked. "Yes," she said simply. "I've been frightened since June. I've just been doing things while being frightened, which is different from not being frightened." He was quiet for a moment. "That's braver than not being frightened at all." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the dark horizon, his profile in the starlight clear and serious, and she felt the thing she had been feeling for 2 weeks and had been carefully managing rise up and refuse to be managed quite so carefully anymore. "Elijah," she said. He turned. "I think," she said, "that when this is over, when Thomas is safe and the documents are filed and whatever is going to happen has happened, I think I would like to know what this is." She gestured between them, a small motion. "What it could be." "If you're willing." He looked at her for a long time in the starlight. "I've been willing," he said, "since about the 2nd morning when you made coffee and told me to sit down." "That was bossy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I found it entirely charming." She laughed quietly so as not to wake the sleepers, and the laugh was genuine and warm and entirely different from the careful composure she had been wearing like armor, and Elijah Sutton heard it and felt something in himself that had been locked for a long time come open. He reached over and took her hand, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back at his face, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said at that particular moment. And the stars continued overhead, indifferent and ancient and somehow appropriate. They reached Wichita on the 4th day, road-weary and sunburned, and carrying the leather packet of documents that Thomas had kept safe for 4 months under a floorboard in a line cabin on land that did not legally belong to the man who had used it to confine him. The Territorial Land Office was on a main street that was considerably more crowded and considerably louder than anything Naomi had seen since leaving Caldwell, and the contrast between the prairie silence of the past days and this urban noise was startling in a physical way, like stepping from cold water into warmth. Elijah knew a lawyer in Wichita. His name was Arthur Crane, and he was a thin man of about 50, with an extraordinary collection of reference books in his office, and the disposition of a bloodhound who has caught a scent he finds professionally exciting. Elijah had met him through correspondence. Crane had written an article about territorial land law in a legal journal that Elijah had somehow acquired and read, and the introduction was strange and brief and instantly productive because Crane took one look at the documents and said, "Where did you get these?" "That's a longer story than we have time for," Elijah said. "Can you use them?" "Can I?" "Yes, I can certainly use them. There are 3 separate fraudulent filings here, and if the original homesteaders can be located—" "One is deceased," Thomas said. He was sitting in a chair with a glass of water and the look of a man being reintroduced to civilization, one detail at a time. "Henry Marsh, who held the southwestern claim. He died 2 years ago. His wife went to live with her sister in Missouri. I have her name in the packet, Clara Marsh." "Locating Mrs. Marsh would be the first step," Crane said. He was already taking notes. "And the surviving homesteaders, the Caldwell Pruitts," Thomas said. "Not Calvin Pruitt, his father Jacob Pruitt, who originally held the eastern claim. He sold under pressure and went to live with his son, which is why Calvin Pruitt is so willing to do what Renner asks. Renner has been funding Calvin's operation in exchange for that cooperation." Elijah looked at Thomas with considerable respect. "You've been thinking about this for 4 months in a cabin." "I had time," Thomas said. "He's the smart one," Naomi said, looking at her brother with an expression of profound affection. "He always was." Crane worked quickly, and with an enthusiasm that made it clear that the case was the kind that territorial lawyers dreamed about: a clear paper trail, identifiable victims, and a defendant whose confidence in his own immunity had led him to be considerably less careful than he should have been. The filing was made with the Territorial Land Office within 2 days, and from there, the matter moved to the federal level with a speed that surprised even Crane, because it turned out that the Federal Land Commissioner had already received 2 separate complaints about Renner's operation from homesteaders who had not been able to prove their claims, but had been persistent enough to be on record. The combination of what Thomas had preserved and the existing federal interest was, in Crane's words, a complete case. Renner was arrested 6 weeks later by federal marshals at his Maine ranch house. Calvin Pruitt, when informed of the extent of the legal exposure he faced, agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced charge. The testimony confirmed everything Thomas had documented and added several additional items that made the case against Renner more comprehensive than it had already been. None of this happened quickly or easily, and it required Elijah and Naomi to spend much of October in Wichita, which was not the hardest thing either of them had done, but was not comfortable either, particularly since funds were limited. They stayed in a boarding house that Crane recommended, in rooms that were small and across the hall from each other, and this arrangement was both more and less comfortable than the cabin had been for reasons that Elijah thought about more than was entirely practical given the circumstances. But during those weeks in Wichita, something happened between them that had not quite had space to happen before. They talked. Not about Renner or Thomas or land documents, but about themselves, in the way you talk when you are no longer managing an emergency, and the person across from you is no longer simply a partner in that emergency, but a person you want to know more about. He told her about the years after his father died, the years of working ranch after ranch across Missouri and Kansas, the way the open land had given him room when room was what he needed. He told her about the books that he had always read, that reading had been the thing he carried with him that kept some part of himself intact when the circumstances of his life were not particularly kind. He told her about a period 2 years prior when he had been so profoundly lonely that the loneliness had taken on a physical character, a weight he could feel. She told him about the school in St. Louis, and the students she had cared about, and the anger of losing that work. She told him about the months of looking for Thomas, which had been terrifying in a slow, accumulating way that was different from the sharp terror of the scaffold, but in some ways harder to sustain. She told him about what she wanted. She said this simply and directly, because she was a direct person, which was to do work that mattered, to have a home that was real, to stop being alone in the way she had been alone since their father died. "You're not alone anymore," he said, one evening in October in the parlor of the boarding house, while Thomas was at dinner with Crane and Jonas had long since returned to his trading circuit. She looked at him, and the lamplight was warm, and she was wearing a different dress because Martha McAllister had quietly sent some of her daughter's clothes to Wichita, which had been one of the most unexpectedly moving kindnesses Naomi had received, and she looked like herself in a way that was different from how she had looked in the red-stained dress on the scaffold. She looked settled. She looked present. She looked like she had arrived somewhere. "No," she said, "I'm not." He moved across the parlor and sat beside her on the settee, and took her face in both his hands with a care that was not tentative but deliberate, as though he was making a clear choice, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the full presence she brought to everything. And it was not a tentative thing or a question but an answer, and they were both aware that it was an answer to something that had been asked since the scaffold, since the first morning. Since he had said the rope is already around your neck, and she had said all right. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I know this started in a strange way," he said. "Most things worth having start strangely," she said. "I'm not going to be able to provide you with a great deal," he said, with the honesty of a man who has thought about this. "I have my wages and the cabin and—" "Elijah," she said, "I have been riding alone across Kansas for 3 months looking for my brother, who was being held in a line cabin by a fraudulent land baron. I have stood on a scaffold with a rope around my neck. I have spent the last 2 months helping to build a federal land fraud case." She paused. "I am not a woman with modest standards, but I am a woman with accurate ones. I know what matters." He looked at her. "What matters?" "You," she said simply, "the honest kind." He kissed her again. The parlor was warm. Outside, Wichita continued its busy frontier noise, horses and voices, and the distant sound of a piano from somewhere down the street. And inside, in the lamplight, 2 people who had come to each other through the most extraordinary series of circumstances were becoming, quietly and thoroughly, something that had no beginning anyone could precisely identify and would have no end that anyone could foresee. Thomas Kingsley watched this development with the expression of a young man who has been rescued from a line cabin by his sister and her inexplicable but clearly devoted husband, and who therefore considers himself in no position to have opinions about anything. He kept his opinions to himself and focused on eating regularly and recovering his strength, which were both going well. He did say once to Naomi, when Elijah was out of the room, "He's a good man." "Yes," Naomi said. "The good kind that's actually good, and not just the kind that performs goodness for an audience." "Yes," Naomi said again, and something in her face when she said it made Thomas smile in a way that suggested he was going to be insufferable about this for a considerable period of time. They returned to the McAllister ranch in November, when the federal case had been filed and was proceeding through channels that Crane would manage, and when the weather was beginning to remind Kansas that it knew how to be cold and intended to demonstrate this thoroughly. McAllister greeted their return with a handshake for Elijah, a nod for Thomas, and a long look at Naomi that concluded in something that resembled approval. Martha appeared with food, which was consistent with Martha's approach to most situations. The ranch felt like coming home, which surprised Naomi because it was not technically hers, and yet it felt that way, and she recognized that feeling as something to pay attention to. The cabin had been improved in their absence. Martha had seen to it a rag rug on the floor, curtains on the window, an extra shelf that George had apparently built with more speed than elegance but considerable goodwill. Thomas was given a room in the bunkhouse, which he received with gratitude and the slightly dazed quality of a man relearning what it was to be among people in an ordinary way. The winter settled in around the ranch with the particular intimacy of frontier winters, where the cold and the isolation press people together, and the long evenings require either good company or bad habits. Elijah and Naomi had good company in each other, which made the winter a different kind of experience than any winter either of them had spent before. They read together in the evenings, which had begun because Elijah had more books than she had expected, and she had borrowed one and they had ended up talking about it for 2 hours. And then it had simply continued, the reading and the talking ranged widely: law and land policy, history, the question of what the territory was becoming and what it ought to become, the specific and growing reality of what their life was and what they wanted it to be. One evening in December, a rare snowfall covering the Kansas prairie in a silence that felt borrowed from somewhere gentler, Naomi sat at the table with the lamp and her journal and wrote for a long time while Elijah read, and when she set her pen down, she said, "I want to teach again." He looked up. "Not a regular school, necessarily. Thomas and I have been talking about it." She paused. "There are children on ranches throughout this territory who have no access to any education whatsoever. Homestead children, the children of ranch hands, children whose families can't afford school boards and school buildings. I could teach them." "How?" he said, and his tone was genuinely interested, not doubtful. "A traveling school. I could ride a circuit Mac Allister's ranch and several others within a day's ride. Thomas could help. He's good with numbers, better than I am." She looked at him directly. Is that something that—" "Yes," he said. "I haven't finished explaining. Whatever you're about to say, the answer is yes," he said. "Because I've been watching you for 4 months not be able to do the work you should be doing, and you have been patient about it, but I've seen what it costs you, and the answer is yes, do the thing." She looked at him for a long time. "You are unexpectedly good at this," she said. "At what?" "Seeing people," she said. "The way my father did, he was the same way. He would look at you and you felt seen." She paused. "I didn't expect to find that again." Elijah set his book down carefully. He crossed the small cabin in 3 steps and took her hand across the table and held it, and they were quiet together in the way of people for whom quiet has become comfortable, which is different from silence and considerably more valuable. "Naomi," he said. "Yes." "This marriage," he said. "I want you to know I know how it started. I know what it was at the beginning, but it isn't that anymore. For me it isn't that, and I want to be clear about it." She looked at his face. "What is it now?" "The realest thing I have," he said, simply and directly, in the way he said most things, and she received this with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, which meant that she did not look away and she did not minimize it. "For me too," she said. "Since the boarding house in Wichita, I think. Perhaps before that. Perhaps since the scaffold," he said, and there was a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "That would be extremely fast," she said. "You were remarkably composed on that scaffold," he said. "I was terrified on that scaffold." "You were composed and terrified," he said, "which I found—" "Don't say charming again." "I was going to say unforgettable," he said. She laughed, and he watched her laugh the way he had been watching her since August, with the quiet hunger of someone who cannot believe their luck and is not yet entirely certain they have not imagined it. Christmas came to the Mac Allister Ranch with the modest but genuine warmth of people who know how to celebrate what they have, and Martha made a dinner that was extraordinary in the context of prairie winter, and George Mac Allister told stories about Tennessee that somehow always ended in Kansas, and Thomas Kingsley, increasingly restored and increasingly himself, played the harmonica, which nobody had known about and which turned out to be genuinely good. And Naomi and Elijah danced in the main room of the ranch house to music that was simple and earnest and very much in the right key. He held her close when they danced, and she let herself be held, which was not nothing, which was in fact a great deal, because Naomi Kingsley had spent most of her life managing things herself and holding herself at a slight remove from situations that might ask too much of her, and letting herself be held was a choice, and she made it with full awareness. "I love you," he said against her hair, quietly enough that it was only for her. She was still for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And," he said. "And I love you," she said. "Also for a while, I think since the night you told me about your mother, in the dark. You didn't have to tell me that, and you did. And that was when I knew." He kissed her in the middle of the dancing, which Thomas pretended not to notice, and Martha noticed with great satisfaction, and George looked at for a moment before deciding to refill his cup. The Renner case concluded in the spring of 1879. The federal court found in favor of the original homesteaders and their estates in all three fraudulent filings. Renner was sentenced to 5 years in the federal prison in Leavenworth. Calvin Prout lost his ranch operation but avoided prison, which was a matter on which Naomi had complicated feelings. She felt the punishment insufficient but understood that the testimony had been necessary, and she filed the complication in that part of her mind where she kept things to be addressed over time. Jacob Prout, Calvin's father, who had sold his eastern claim under duress, received compensation from the federal settlement. Clara Marsh, widow of Henry Marsh, received a considerably larger settlement for the estate her husband had lost. She wrote a letter to Arthur Crane in which she expressed gratitude in such particular and heartfelt terms that Crane read it twice and then framed it, which was not something he typically did. The charge against Naomi, horse theft and the killing of Deputy Webb, was formally reviewed by the territorial court in the context of the Renner findings. The review established that Webb had been in Renner's employ in a capacity that explained his conduct toward Naomi, and that the evidence of her involvement in his death was circumstantial and heavily reliant on testimony from parties who were now under federal indictment. The charge was dismissed. Judge Whitmore, who had performed the hasty scaffold marriage the previous August, signed the dismissal order with the air of a man setting an account right. Sheriff Monroe Hackett remained in his position, because the political machinery of Caldwell did not move as quickly as federal courts, but he was a considerably more careful man for the experience, and he did not trouble Naomi Kingsley again. The spring of 1879 was warm and early, and the Kansas prairie expressed its relief at the passing of winter, with an explosion of wildflowers that turned the grassland briefly into something that looked like a painting. Naomi had started her traveling school by March, riding a small circuit that included the McAllister Ranch, the neighboring Decker homestead, and 2 other small ranches within a day's travel. She had 7 students to begin with, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she taught them reading and arithmetic and history and geography with the efficiency of someone who had a great deal to teach and was not going to waste any available time. Thomas helped on the days when she covered the farther ranches. He had, after considerable thought, decided to stay in the territory rather than return to Kansas City. He had found work at the McAllister Ranch in a bookkeeping capacity that suited his talent for numbers, and he was learning the cattle work on the side with the diligence of a man who understands that practical knowledge is its own kind of freedom. He had also, over the course of the winter, developed a friendship with Jonah's white horse that had evolved into something that looked very much like a business partnership, the 2 of them trading in goods along the Cheyenne routes with a fairness and efficiency that was gaining them a good reputation in the territory. Elijah had a conversation with George McAllister in early April that changed his situation considerably. McAllister, who was no fool and who had been watching Elijah for 3 years with the attention of a man looking at someone he intends to retain, offered him a partnership stake in the ranch. Not a majority stake. McAllister was not that sentimental, but a genuine share of the operation, with the understanding that Elijah would take on the management of the northern range that had been pressing against Renner's former territory, and that would now be available for legal expansion. Elijah accepted. He came back to the cabin that afternoon and told Naomi, and she put her arms around him and held on with the full-bodied embrace of someone for whom happiness is not a quiet thing, and he lifted her slightly off the ground without quite intending to, and they were both laughing. And it was the kind of moment that people carry with them for the rest of their lives and take out occasionally to look at. "We could build," he said when she was back on her feet. "A proper house, not this cabin." "I like this cabin," she said. "You could like a house," he said. "I could," she agreed. "Something with enough room for the school materials and a window that faces south." "Done," he said. "You can't just say done. There are practical done," he said again, with the smile that she had been watching develop over the winter. The one that was not his careful public face, but the one underneath it. The one that appeared when he was very happy or very amused or looking at her, and which she had come to recognize as the truest thing about him. The house was built over the summer, with help from Mac Allister's hands and from Thomas, who turned out to have an unexpected gift for carpentry, and from Jonah's, who arrived one week with a load of good timber from a source he declined to specify, and installed it before anyone could ask too many questions. It was a house of modest dimensions but genuine quality, with a south-facing window in the main room, a kitchen that was larger than the whole previous cabin, a room that Naomi designated firmly for school materials, and a bedroom that looked out over the prairie toward the east. Naomi and Elijah moved into the house in August, on the one-year anniversary of the morning in Caldwell, which neither of them mentioned aloud until the evening, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down over the western grass. "A year ago today," Naomi said. "Yes," he said. "I was on a scaffold," she said. "You were very composed about it," he said. "I was not." She paused. "I was extremely frightened, and I was angry, and I was thinking about Thomas, and I was trying not to cry. And then a man stepped out of the crowd," he said. "A stranger," she said, "who I didn't know and who apparently had his mother's ring in his vest pocket." A pause. He looked at her. "I'd had that ring since she died," he said. "I don't know why I had it that day. I didn't usually carry it." She looked at him. "Why did you that day?" "I don't know," he said simply and honestly. "I can't account for it." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built in the last light of the summer evening, with the prairie rolling out around them in all directions, and the sky doing what the Kansas sky did at that hour, turning colors that seemed excessive and were somehow always exactly right. "Thank you," she said, "for stepping forward." "Thank you," he said, "for saying all right." She laughed, and he kissed her temple, and they stayed on the porch until the stars came out, which happened slowly and then all at once, the way the best things do. In September of 1879, Naomi's school had grown to 11 students, and she had been approached by the Caldwell School Board about formalizing her work in a way that would provide public funding. The approach had come with the characteristic awkwardness of an institution, acknowledging someone it had previously dismissed, but Naomi received it with practical grace and negotiated terms that gave her considerable autonomy, a condition she had established as non-negotiable from the outset, and which the board had accepted because they had been told by several ranchers that if they did not accept it, they would find themselves explaining to those ranchers why their children were not receiving an education. Elijah had said nothing during those negotiations. He had sat in the corner of the meeting room with his hat in his hands and let Naomi conduct the thing herself, because he understood that his presence was support and his silence was trust, and that both were exactly what was required. Afterward, walking back along the main street of Caldwell toward where their horses were hitched, they came to town together now, which people had stopped remarking on after a while. Naomi had taken his arm in a way that was unself-conscious and proprietary, the gesture of someone who is certain of where they are and with whom. "You didn't say anything," she said. "There was nothing for me to say," he said. "You had it. You could have pushed them harder on the funding figure." "I could have," he said, "but it wasn't my negotiation, and you'll make up the difference when you expand to the eastern ranches next year, which we both know you're planning." She looked up at him. "How do you know I'm planning that?" "Because you've mentioned the eastern ranches 14 times in the past 3 months in a way that suggests you're not planning to go there but are in fact planning to go there." I have not mentioned them 14 times. 12 times, possibly. I may have overcounted." She was laughing again, and they walked along the Caldwell Main Street where 8 months ago a scaffold had stood, and it was gone now, which was Sheriff Hackett's contribution to a town that was trying to decide what kind of town it wanted to be, and the street looked better without it. The first real snow of the winter of 1879 came in November, and it was a heavy one, the kind that settled in and meant business, and the ranch quieted into the indoor rhythms that Naomi had come to associate with the best kind of closeness. Thomas came to dinner twice a week, which had become a ritual, and they played cards after dinner sometimes, or talked, or sat in a comfortable arrangement of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. On a night in early December, when the snow was thick and the stove was going strong and Elijah was reading and Naomi was at her desk working on lesson plans with the focused energy that she brought to all of her teaching work, she put her pen down and looked at the wall for a moment and then said, "Elijah." "Yes," he said, without looking up from his book. "I think I'm going to have a baby," she said. He looked up. She turned from the desk. Her expression was not alarmed, but it was the particular expression of someone standing at the edge of something very large, measuring it. He set the book down with great care, which was his way of giving himself a moment when he needed one. "Are you?" he started. "I think so," she said. "I'm not certain yet, but I think so." He was across the room and crouched in front of her chair before he had quite thought about what he was doing, taking both her hands in both of his. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm very much all right." She paused. "I was afraid to say it out loud because saying it makes it real." "It's real either way," he said gently. "I know," she said. "That's what's overwhelming me at the moment." He looked at her face, at the combination of things in it, joy and fear and wonder and the particular expression of someone encountering something for which they have no precedent, and he felt a rush of something so large that he didn't have a name for it immediately, and then he did. Gratitude. The specific gratitude of a man who had been lonely for a long time and was now thoroughly and completely not. "We're going to be all right," he said. "I know we are," she said. "That's not—" She stopped. She looked at him, really looked in the searching way she had. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. "Naomi," he said. "I'm so happy about it that I cannot currently construct a sentence adequate to the feeling." She put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment, close and quiet, in the warm cabin while the snow fell outside. Martha McAllister, informed 3 weeks later, cried briefly, and then organized herself into a state of comprehensive practical preparation that involved the production of several quilts, the identification of the nearest qualified physician in Wichita, and the constitution of a plan for the spring that left nothing to chance. Martha's approach to happiness was to make it as safe as possible, which was not the worst approach. Thomas Kingsley, informed at dinner, put his fork down and looked at his sister for a moment and then said, very quietly, "Dad would have liked him." He meant Elijah, and both of them understood this, and Naomi had to look at the ceiling for a moment before she was fully composed again. Elijah clasped Thomas's hand across the table, and something passed between the two men that needed no words and received none. The winter passed with the ordinary weight of winter and the extraordinary lightness of anticipation. Naomi continued teaching through December and January, scaling back slightly in February when the cold made the longer rides impractical. She did not stop. It did not occur to her to stop entirely, but she allowed herself to accept the adjustments that were practical without interpreting them as defeat, which was a form of growth that Elijah noticed and admired without mentioning it too directly, because he had learned the particular art of being present for Naomi's internal negotiations without inserting himself into them. He took on more of the domestic work without being asked, and she led him without making it into a conversation, and they moved around each other in the house with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms, the small daily choreography of a shared life that is both very ordinary and, when you pay attention, quite remarkable. On the 15th of April, 1880, their son was born. He was a solid, loud, thoroughly determined sort of baby, and the physician from Wichita arrived just in time, which was better than the alternative. And Martha McAllister was there, and was magnificent. And Thomas sat on the porch of the house all night in the April cold, because there was nothing useful he could do inside, and he could not make himself go anywhere farther. Elijah was beside Naomi for all of it. She had told him she wanted him there, and he was there, and he did not faint or do anything unhelpful, which was a standard he felt was appropriately minimal. And when the baby was finally in her arms, and she looked from the baby to him, Elijah Sutton discovered that the sentence he had been unable to construct in December was still not available to him. But he didn't need it, because Naomi was looking at him with everything he needed to see. They named the boy Daniel James Sutton. Daniel had been Elijah's father's name. James had been Naomi's. The connection seemed right in the way that some things are simply right without requiring justification. Daniel James Sutton was, from the beginning, a person with very clear opinions about most things, which did not surprise anyone who knew either of his parents. He had Naomi's eyes green and direct, and Elijah's jaw, which on a baby was somewhat incongruous, but which everyone agreed would be distinguished later. Thomas rode from the McAllister ranch the morning after the birth and arrived at the house to find Elijah on the porch with the particular expression of a man who has experienced something so large that he has not yet fully arranged it into anything manageable. Thomas sat beside him and they were quiet for a while. "Is she all right?" Thomas asked. "She's remarkable," Elijah said. "She's always been remarkable," Thomas said. "You finally got to see the full range of it." "I've been seeing the full range of it since August of last year," Elijah said. Thomas looked at him. "You really love her," he said, with the tone of someone confirming something they already knew but wanted to hear directly. "More than I have words for," Elijah said, which is not a comfortable situation for a man who was trained to be precise about language. Thomas laughed, and the morning was bright and clean in the way that spring mornings in Kansas can be when they decide to be generous. And the prairie was green, and the air smelled like growth and wet earth, and everything being new. Inside the house, Naomi was asleep with Daniel against her chest, and the south-facing window was letting in the early light, and the room was warm, and the school lesson plans were stacked on her desk waiting for whenever she was ready to return to them, which would be soon, because Naomi Kingsley was not a woman who stayed still for long. But at this particular moment she was entirely, completely still, and the stillness was peace, not restraint. The years that followed were full in the way that only the best lives are, full of work and children and seasons, and the particular texture of days that add up to a life that has been genuinely lived. The McAllister Ranch grew under Elijah's partnership stake, expanding carefully and legally into the former Renner territory, which was a satisfaction that never entirely grew routine. The school expanded, too. By 1882, Naomi had a formal schoolhouse built at the eastern edge of the McAllister property, funded partly by the school board and partly by a collection among the ranching families whose children she had been teaching. And she had 2 assistants, one of whom was Thomas, who had discovered that he liked teaching mathematics almost as much as he liked numbers themselves. Jonah's white horse became a regular presence at the Sutton table, welcomed with the genuine warmth that is different from the performed warmth that sometimes passed for hospitality on the frontier. He and Thomas had built their trading business into something that operated with considerable integrity and efficiency along the Cheyenne routes, and Jonah's had occasion to tell Elijah privately that he was grateful for the introduction, which Elijah said was very much Thomas's own doing, and Jonah's said that Thomas had needed someone willing to take his offer of partnership seriously, which was Elijah's doing, and they both agreed that the whole thing had worked out well, which was as close to sentimentality as either man was likely to get. Daniel Sutton grew. By the time he was 2, his opinions were organized, and his vocabulary was proceeding at a rate that suggested he had been listening to his mother's lessons from the beginning. He was followed in 1882 by a sister named Clara, named for Clara Marsh, the widow who had received her settlement and whose letter Arthur Crane had framed, and the two children together were a study in complementary temperaments, Daniel direct and decisive in the way of his father, Clara watchful and organizing in the way of her mother. Both of them loved with the complete and practical devotion of parents, who understood that love was a thing you demonstrated daily in small ways as much as in large ones. The case of Renner, the falsified land claims, and the settlement had become a kind of landmark in territorial legal history. Arthur Crane had written about it extensively, and there were references to it in subsequent land fraud cases that Crane tracked with proprietary pride and occasionally sent Elijah clippings about. Elijah read the clippings and filed them without much ceremony because the case had never been the point, though the outcomes mattered. What had mattered in the original moment was the rope. He thought about that sometimes. The rope and the woman standing with her chin lifted, and the crowd, and the particular moment when his body had decided what his mind had not yet caught up with. He was not a mystical man. He was precise and practical in his thinking, but he could not account for having his mother's ring in his vest pocket on that particular morning, and he had stopped trying to account for it. Some things simply were. One evening in the fall of 1883, when Daniel was 3 and Clara was just past 1, and both children were asleep in a house that had been expanded twice since it was first built, Elijah and Naomi sat on the porch the way they often sat on fall evenings, with the harvest smell on the air and the first serious cold of the season still some weeks away, and the stars beginning to come out in the deep blue east. Naomi was looking at the stars. She did this sometimes in the particular way of someone reviewing something internally. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "August 1878, she said. "The scaffold. The moment before the scaffold," she said. "When they brought me out of the jail cell and into the square and I could see it, the scaffold and the rope and the people and all of it." She paused. I remember thinking, this is very far from how I intended things to go." "And now," he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had watched her from the beginning, that she had once found unsettling and had long since found the most familiar and comforting thing in her world. "Now," she said, "I think that it is very far from how I intended things to go, and that this is the best thing that ever happened to me." He reached over and took her hand, which he had been reaching over and taking since a night under Kansas stars, when neither of them had yet said what they were feeling, and yet both had known. His hand was warm and familiar and certain, and she laced her fingers through his and they sat together in the fall dark of 1883, on the porch of the house they had built, in the territory they had helped make a little more just than it had been, with their children asleep inside and the prairie stretching out in every direction, old and immense and full of everything. "I love you," he said, in the way he said it, not dramatically but with the complete attention of someone who means it in every particular. "I love you," she said, "since that boarding house in Wichita, since the line cabin, since the scaffold. Since before the scaffold," he said. "You just didn't know it yet. That's not how time works," she said. "Humor me," he said, and she laughed, and he kissed her, and the stars continued overhead, and the prairie breathed its slow grass breath in the dark. And inside the house Daniel Sutton slept in his small bed with his strong jaw and his mother's green eyes, and Clara Sutton slept in her cradle with her father's watchfulness already visible in her small sleeping face. And everything that had needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that had needed to be found had been found. And what had begun with a rope around a woman's neck on an August morning had become this: the warmth of a hand, the sound of a laugh, the particular fullness of a life that had chosen itself and been chosen, out loud and completely, and without reservation. George Mac Allister would live another 12 years, long enough to see the Mac Allister Sutton Ranch become one of the most well-regarded operations in western Kansas, and long enough to dance at the informal celebration the Suttons held when Daniel started school, Naomi's school, which was by then a building with real glass in the windows and a bell, and which served 32 students from a dozen families across the territory. Martha outlived George by 6 years and spent those years as a person of importance and affection to everyone in the county, which she would have been regardless of whether she outlived him, but she preferred it this way, and so it was arranged. Thomas Kingsley never married, which was a subject he deflected with such practiced ease that after a while people stopped bringing it up. He was instead something better than many marriages. He was genuinely and completely himself, a man of intelligence and quiet decency and unexpected humor, a good teacher and an honest partner to Jonah's in their trading business, and an uncle of such thorough devotion that Daniel and Clara both, at various points in their growing years, considered him the best adult in their acquaintance, which was a distinction he wore without any acknowledgement that he was aware of it. Jonah's white horse continued to move through the territory with the unhurried precision that was his nature, and the trading business that he and Thomas had built became something of a small legend along the Cheyenne routes, known for fair dealing and reliability in a time and place where both were rarer than they should have been. He came to the Sutton house twice a year, at the spring and in the fall, and was received with the welcome of family, which he accepted with the careful dignity of someone who has learned not to take belonging for granted and therefore values it more than most. The schoolhouse that Naomi built was still standing in 1885 and in 1886 and would continue to stand for many years after the period this story covers, the bell ringing across the Kansas morning, the south-facing windows bright with prairie light, the wooden floors worn in the paths where small feet had walked. Among the things inscribed inside the front cover of the school's first record book, in Naomi's clear and particular handwriting, was this: "Learning is not a gift given from the powerful to the powerless. It is a right belonging to everyone who breathes, and our work here is simply the recognition of what was always true." Elijah read this one afternoon when he had come to collect Daniel after school, and he stood in the empty classroom with the afternoon light coming through the south window and the smell of chalk and paper and the specific warmth of a room that has held children all day, and he felt the same thing he had felt that first December evening in the cabin, the settlement, the arrival, the sense of being precisely where he was supposed to be. He told Naomi about it that evening. "I know what you were thinking," she said. "Do you? You were thinking that your father would have been proud," she said. "The lawyer who believed the law should protect people." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those green eyes that had been steady since the scaffold and steady every day since, and the truth of what she had said was so exact that he didn't try to respond to it. He just looked at her, and she at him, and between them was the whole of the last years. The scaffold and the prairie and the line cabin and the stars and the house and the children and all of it, and it was held in that look as completely as it ever needed to be. Outside, Daniel was chasing Clara through the yard with the dedicated energy of a 5-year-old who has decided that this is the most important thing currently happening in the world. Clara was laughing with the high, pure sound of a child who is fully delighted. The prairie rolled out to the west, and the sky was doing its evening excess of color, and the Elijah Sutton cattle were coming in for the night, and somewhere over the eastern line where the Kansas sky went deep and dark, the first star was appearing. Naomi Kingsley, who had become Naomi Sutton on a scaffold with a rope around her neck, who had looked down at a stranger and said all right, and who had found in that stranger the truest and most encompassing love of her life, leaned her shoulder against her husband's, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the doorway of their house in the last light and watched their children play. Everything was found. Everything was whole. The rope was long gone, the scaffold long dismantled, the Renner land returned to the families it belonged to, Thomas Kingsley safe in himself and flourishing, and the wide prairie spread around them in every direction, full of difficulty and beauty and injustice and wildflowers, and the particular ongoing American experiment of making something decent out of something hard. They were part of it, fully, completely, willingly part of it, and they were together. And that, in the end, was everything.